I remember the day I disappeared from her life as vividly as if it were a painting I studied every night. The flight was at sunrise, and I carried nothing more than a half-packed duffel bag that faintly smelled of stale cologne. I left no note, no explanation, and said no goodbyes. Not to her friends, nor to the life we had built together. After discovering her betrayal, I decided there was nothing left to say. She had been my wife, the woman I had devoted every ounce of my being to, and she had shattered the vows we once held sacred. So, I did what felt like the only option. I ghosted her. It sounds harsh, even cruel, but it's the only word that fits the abrupt finality of my departure. I didn't even take all my belongings, just the essentials. Documents I couldn't live without and the photograph of my mother that had been a fixture in my wallet for years. As I tossed my phone into a trash bin before boarding the plane, wiping all traces of myself from its memory, I felt a pang of loss. But I ignored it. I convinced myself this was the grand gesture I needed to close that painful chapter of my life. I fled to a place I barely knew, a nondescript town far from where we had built our home. The streets were unremarkable, the kind that wouldn't even register on a map unless you were searching for it. It was a small coastal town with a single main street, lined with shops selling seashell trinkets and homemade fudge, their windows adorned with postcards of sunsets and seagulls. The air smelled of salt, and the beaches stretched endlessly, dotted with small fishing boats. Nobody asked questions when I rented a studio apartment above a shuttered gift shop. My landlord was an older man with a permanent scowl who seemed to understand instinctively that I wanted to be left alone. Here I introduced myself as John, a plain, forgettable alias, and gave no details about the man I had been before. For weeks, I spent my days wandering the shoreline, watching gulls dive for fish and letting the rhythmic crash of waves drown out my spiraling thoughts. Sometimes, I'd sit in a small cafe that overlooked the harbor, sipping coffee and scanning the local newspaper, half-heartedly searching for work. My previous life felt like a distant dream. I had traded my suit-and-tie marketing job for solitude, my suburban home for this modest studio. At night, I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, disheveled hair, hollow eyes, a stranger staring back. Yet despite the loneliness, I felt an odd sense of liberation. I was no longer tethered to her lies or the wounds they had left behind. Eventually, I found work on a small fishing boat that trawled for crabs and shrimp. The hours were brutal, the work backbreaking, but it left little room for bitterness or regret. I woke before dawn each morning, meeting the grizzled captain and his small crew at the docks. We hauled traps, sorted the catch, and scrubbed the deck until our muscles burned. By noon, I reeked of salt and fish, my arms nicked with small cuts from the ropes and traps. But the physical labor was cathartic, a reprieve from the emotional scars I was still nursing. Days blurred into weeks, and the quiet monotony of the town began to feel like a balm. I lived simply, cooking meager meals on a hot plate, reading old paperbacks, and walking the beaches alone. I believed I had finally disappeared, that I was beyond her reach. But that illusion shattered one windy afternoon. I was sitting on the rickety steps leading to my apartment, enjoying a rare break in my routine, when my landlord handed me the day's mail. Among the grocery store coupons and advertisements was a plain white envelope. My breath caught when I saw the name scrawled on it. John. No one here knew my real name, and no one had reason to write to me. With shaking hands I tore it open. Inside was a letter written in careful, familiar handwriting. "I understand why you left," it began. "But please let me explain. I'll be at the library in Gulfport every Saturday until I hear from you." It was signed with a single initial, E. Lena, my wife. Her name struck me like a lightning bolt, dredging up feelings I had buried deep. Anger, heartbreak, and something I wasn't ready to name. How had she found me? How had she uncovered the alias I'd so carefully crafted? My first instinct was to destroy the letter, to pretend it had never arrived. But curiosity gnawed at me. Days passed, and though I told no one about the letter, it consumed my thoughts. I wrestled with the idea of seeing her again, torn between the urge to confront her and the fear of reopening old wounds. By Saturday, curiosity won. I drove my beat-up pickup to Gulfport, following the winding coastal road to the small library she had mentioned. It was a modest building, its worn brick facade framed by overgrown shrubs. Inside, the smell of old paper and ink transported me to a time when life had been simpler, when we had first met as students in a university library. My heart pounded as I wandered through the aisles, scanning the faces of strangers and bracing myself for the sight of hers. I found her in a corner of the reading room. She wore a navy coat, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, her fingers fidgeting nervously with a magazine. Time had softened her features but hadn't stolen her beauty. For a moment, I stood frozen, hidden partially by a tall bookshelf. Memories flooded me, both good and bad. I thought of the way she used to look at me as if I were her whole world, and then, cruelly, of the betrayal that had shattered everything we'd built. Finally, I stepped forward. She didn't notice me until I was just a few feet away. When she looked up, her eyes widened in surprise, followed by a flicker of relief, then regret. "You're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. We didn't embrace. Instead, we stood there, awkwardly separated by an invisible chasm carved by years of pain and silence. She gestured toward the table, and we sat down across from each other. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, a gentle rhythm that made the moment feel surreal. For a long, heavy moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally she broke the silence. I remember the weight of her voice as she said, "I'm so sorry," trembling with regret. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and I could see her struggling to keep her composure. "I know I don't deserve to ask anything of you," she continued, her voice fragile, "but please just let me explain." I sat there stone-faced, listening. My silence felt heavy, oppressive, like a wall between us. She began to recount her side of the story, the betrayal that had shattered the life we'd built. She admitted that the affair was a moment of weakness, a lapse born of loneliness and resentment. She confessed how she'd felt invisible, as if I had poured all my energy into my career while neglecting her. Her words didn't excuse what she had done, and I could see that she knew this. Yet every gesture, every faltering sentence, dripped with raw regret. Her tears finally broke free as she admitted how desperately she had searched for me since the day I disappeared. She spoke of private investigators, of endless social media searches, of pleading with mutual friends for even a fragment of a lead. Years of searching had yielded nothing, until a chance photograph of me, shared by a passerby in this tiny fishing town, brought her here. I marveled at her persistence. At the same time, I felt sickened by the realization that, even here, in this forgotten corner of the world, I couldn't fully escape her shadow. "I'm not asking you to take me back," she said, her voice breaking. "But I want you to understand how sorry I am. I've spent every day wishing I could go back in time and undo what I did." She reached out, her hand trembling as it moved toward mine. I pulled away without hesitation. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glare on her face, illuminating every trace of anguish etched into her features. "I'm different now," she continued, her voice softer but no less urgent. "I've been in therapy. I've worked on myself. I've faced the truth of what I did, and I know I hurt you in a way that can never truly be undone." She paused, inhaling shakily. "But I need you to see that I'm not the same person who betrayed you." Her words hung in the air, a fragile offering between us. I stared at her, my emotions tangled in a war between anger and compassion. Finally I stood, my shoulders rigid, my jaw clenched. "You can't fix what you broke," I said, my voice low but firm. "I gave you everything, and you threw it away for someone else." My voice cracked against my will, betraying the raw wound I still carried. Her tears flowed freely now, but she didn't look away or try to defend herself. She simply nodded, accepting the truth in my words. Without another glance, I turned and left, the soft patter of rain against the library windows echoing in my ears as I walked out into the storm. My chest felt heavy, my mind spinning with conflicted emotions. Part of me wanted to turn back, to see if there was anything worth salvaging between us. But the larger part remembered the sting of her betrayal too vividly. That night sleep eluded me. Her face, her voice, the unbearable regret in her eyes. All of it replayed in my mind. The memory of what she had done remained sharp, like a shard of glass lodged in my heart. But beneath the anger, something unexpected stirred. A faint, stubborn flicker of the love we had once shared. Days passed, and I threw myself into the grueling routine of work on the fishing boat. The hours were long and physically punishing, leaving little room for introspection. But no amount of labor could erase the questions that gnawed at me. Was I right to leave her behind so completely? Could I ever let go of the bitterness that had consumed me? By the following weekend, I found myself back at the library, driven by a need I couldn't quite articulate. She was there, just as before, seated in the same corner, nervously flipping through a magazine. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes lit with cautious hope. We sat across from each other, the air between us thick with unspoken words. This time the conversation was slower, more deliberate. She spoke of the life she had lived after I left, the job she lost, the depression that followed, the countless nights she spent replaying her mistakes. She described the long road to recovery, the therapy sessions that forced her to confront her failures, the way she had tried to rebuild herself from the wreckage of her choices. Her honesty was disarming. For so long I had carried my anger like armor, shielding myself from the pain of what she had done. But here she was, stripping away every pretense, exposing her vulnerability without flinching. I found myself asking questions I thought I'd never voice. Why him? How long? Did she regret it immediately? Or only after I discovered the truth? She answered each question with quiet candor, never once evading responsibility. Her openness left me feeling raw, as though the wound I had buried for years was being torn open again, but this time it was being cleaned, exposed to the air. In the weeks that followed, we continued to meet at the library. Our conversations were painful but cathartic, each one peeling back another layer of hurt and misunderstanding. We spoke of the good times we had shared, the laughter and love that once defined our marriage. We also confronted the darker moments, the subtle ways we had both contributed to the chasm that had eventually swallowed us whole. Slowly, we began to see each other not as the villain and the victim, but as two deeply flawed people who had once loved each other fiercely. It wasn't reconciliation, not exactly, but it was something close to understanding. Then, one afternoon as we left the library, everything changed. The man she had betrayed me with appeared out of nowhere. His face twisted with fury. He hurled accusations and threats, his voice a venomous hiss. Elena stepped between us, pleading with him to leave, but his rage was uncontrollable. The librarian called the police, and he fled before they arrived. Shaken, Elena confessed that he had been stalking her, sending threatening messages ever since she cut ties with him. Fear began to creep into our fragile peace, and I found myself watching the shadows outside my window at night, uneasy in a way I hadn't felt since I left my old life behind. One morning, I woke to find her gone. On the table, she left a note. "I'm going to fix this for good." Hours later, the police arrived with grim news. She had confronted him near the cliffs. Witnesses saw a fight break out, and in the chaos, she slipped over the edge. The sea was relentless that day, and all they recovered was her coat, torn and tangled on the rocks below. My world collapsed. For years, I had nursed my anger, letting it harden into a shield. Now, faced with the finality of her absence, I realized how much of my heart she still held. At her memorial, I stood apart from the others, the weight of unfinished conversations crushing me. She had sought my forgiveness, but time had stolen the chance to grant it. As I stared at her photograph, a bittersweet image of happier times, I felt an ache so deep it threatened to consume me. And so, I am left haunted by the questions that will never be answered, by the words left unsaid, and by the shadow of what might have been.